What's the deal with podcast download numbers? They're easy to track, but what do they actually mean? It's all too easy to fall into the trap of obsessing over them. Maybe you're already staying up all night wondering how to improve your stats, without considering whether they're worth your attention in the first place. The truth of the matter is, these stats vary massively depending on the type of podcast you're making, and they're not the be-all and end-all for your show. Don't let the figures dominate your outlook on your own podcast. Allow us to put your mind at ease. I'm Matt from Podcast.co, and this is our guide to help you break down the podcast download numbers. But before we get into the video, do you know about Matchmaker.fm? It's a great tool for marketing yourself, your product, or your podcast. Find and book new guests for your show, and get yourself onto shows created by other podcasters around the world. Anyway, back to the video. The question of whether you should care about download numbers can be answered simply. Not really. But don't stop the video just yet, because they're somewhat important when it comes to monetizing your podcast. Although, if the only reason you made a podcast in the first place was to make a quick buck, then sorry to break it to you, but I'm going to have to show you the door because you're in the wrong industry. Despite headlines you may have seen about $100 million Spotify deals for the likes of Joe Rogan, podcasting just isn't, and never has been, a get-rich-quick scheme. The reality is that it takes most podcasters years of hard work and dedication before they're able to make a penny from their show. And the drive to keep going is down to the fact the people behind it love the process itself, not because they're chasing dollar signs. Now that we've got the harsh truth out of the way, here's a necessary reminder to try and not obsess over your download numbers. Yes, they're a useful readout for assessing if what you're doing is working. No, it's not where all your attention should be. Don't forget that the social media culture we're living in makes it so easy to get caught up in a numbers game. What we see when it comes to likes, views, and impressions can make us lose sight of what they actually represent. It's about framing your download numbers in the right way. Now, you may be a bit disheartened if you're not hitting at least 120 downloads per episode, but you shouldn't be. When we spoke to podcasting veteran and author of Podcasting for Dummies, Evo Terra, he provided a useful analogy that helps to put the point in perspective.
It's the opportunity to get on stage and speak to 100 people every week or every other week, whatever it happens to be. Mm-hmm. You know, forget podcasting. If you were able to do that, if you knew that every Wednesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you could walk down to the town square and waiting for you to get up on stage were 100 people in the audience. That would be awesome. I mean, most businesses that I know, most small businesses that I know, would love to have that kind of an opportunity. What you wouldn't worry too much about is, was my audience 102 people last week and now it's only 98? You wouldn't worry about that. I mean, you still have 90 to 100 people out there. You'd find ways to talk to those people. You'd find ways to encourage those people to interact with your business and find ways to track whether or not what you're saying matter to those 100, 200, whatever the number is. You'd find opportunity, you would know whether or not that you were saying the right things that those people wanted to hear over and over again and how it impacted your business. Mm-hmm. That's the real power of podcasting, because your business doesn't grow because you grew your show from 100 to 300 listeners. There's zero extra dollars you get for every listener. You extract value from your audience by giving them value so they come and do business with your company.
For more pearls of wisdom from Evo, check out the full conversation we had with him in the link description. So regardless of whether the interaction is happening digitally, it doesn't detract from its value. And that's why it's so important not to fall into the trap of obsessing over your download numbers. Having a regular audience of any size is an achievement in itself, and one that you shouldn't take for granted. It's also important to ensure that what you're communicating keeps your listeners engaged. So don't focus on how many people are listening, but rather who is listening. Now it's time to understand the nuances of download numbers. You may find yourself, when looking at your own numbers, wondering why they're so different to the numbers that other podcasters have, or different from ones you're used to getting on other platforms. The thing is, it's harder than you might think to compare yourself in a way that makes any kind of sense. This takes us back to the fact that podcast downloads are a way more complicated statistic than you might think. If you haven't already, you've got to start thinking about how many multiple factors come into play before that download number is spat out. Here's why you can't rely on it alone to measure your success. Firstly, if you didn't already know, your podcast metrics are going to be different from the numbers you're probably used to looking at. Social media platforms like Instagram and Twitter have us addicted to practically endless scrolling, and liking a post takes, half a second? Which means the number of likes or followers you have is most likely going to be a lot higher than the download numbers you're seeing. And it's exactly the same with views on any YouTube videos. Any with clickbait titles, there are a lot of them, eye-catching thumbnails, and YouTube's own algorithm for recommended videos can all lead to people clicking on a video and watching for a few seconds. And those few seconds will be counted as a view. As a result, social media metrics are bound to be higher on average than those for podcasts. Keep in mind that taking in an entire podcast episode also demands a significant commitment from every listener as well. Unlike most other forms of content online, podcast episodes tend to be on the longer side, or at least longer than any TikTok out there. And so the listener is automatically required to commit. Therefore, the whole idea of what seems like a high number has to be different when it comes to podcast download figures. What could be a very average looking number for your social media accounts could actually be very impressive for the number of listeners who tuned into your podcast. Then there's the other matter of competition, which has only expanded with time. Spotify reportedly added over 1 million podcasts to their catalogue in 2021, which is a mammoth mob of content creators all vying for attention. The truth is that it's a far more crowded market than it used to be, which means that growing a podcast without having an established audience in the first place is harder. That's not to say that it can't be done, it just means you're likely going to need a little patience. So try not to compare your numbers to the other podcasts that already have an audience. Success is so often more a case of persistence and consistency than anything else. And you've got to keep that persistence and consistency when considering your potential audience reach. Even if you've got a small number of listeners, they're far from worthless. What you need to do is look at the amount of listeners as a proportion of your potential audience, i.e., how many listeners you could realistically hope to have. And that's going to be determined by the number of people who care about your topic enough to dedicate the time to it, and just how many of those people are listening to podcasts. It's also worth mentioning that the size of your potential audience is going to differ depending on the type of podcast you're making. The more niche your topic is, the smaller the audience is going to be. But the upside here is that it's also more likely your listeners will be well aware of what you're trying to do. If your podcast is focused on, let's say, knitting hats for dogs, it's almost certainly going to have fewer listeners than a fiction or news podcast, unless I'm severely underestimating the demand for canine headwear. However, it does mean that your regular listeners are likely to be super into their knitting and dogs. And it's these listeners that are likely to be interested if you were to launch a range of, patterned hats for purchase. Having a smaller audience can in fact be a huge benefit if it means you're passionate about what you're doing. Remember, if you create a podcast that everyone likes, nobody will love it. Find what you're passionate about and tap into why others would or should be passionate about it too. Taking into account everything we've covered, it's safe to say that it's best to take podcast download numbers with a pinch of salt. Avoid getting sucked into a numbers game when there's no rhyme or reason. Focus on audience engagement. Even though it's harder to gauge, it's way more important. In short, keeping a brief eye on your download numbers won't hurt. And if you're getting more than 124 downloads for each episode, bravo! You should be chuffed with yourself because you're above average. Don't forget that any audience, no matter the size, is valuable. Keeping your listeners engaged should be your priority over winning a numbers game. For more info on what we've discussed, as well as a whole range of other resources to help you with your podcasts, take a look at the Podcast.co blog on our website. Link in the description.